Here's how you know you're talking to a Zillennial. They laugh when millennials reminisce about dial-up internet, but can't quite remember it themselves. They nod along when Gen Z talks about growing up with iPads, but their first phone was definitely a flip phone. They code switch constantly, aging up with their millennial coworkers, aging down with their Gen Z siblings, always translating, never quite belonging to either side. If you were born between 1993 and 1998, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're part of a micro-generation that nobody planned for, too young to be a millennial, too old to be Gen Z. And that constant identity crisis? That's not a personality flaw, that's psychology. Because Zillennials occupy a space in history that will never exist again. They're the only generation that watched the world transform from analog to digital during the exact years when identity gets cemented. And that created a psychological profile so contradictory, so in between, that even they can't figure out where they belong. Picture this. You're in a work meeting, and your older millennial colleague starts talking about MSN Messenger and waiting for songs to download on LimeWire. You laugh. You nod. But you don't actually remember any of it. You just know you're supposed to. Then you go home, and your younger Gen Z sibling is making TikToks, and you think, I'm too old for this. But you're only 27. According to Urban Dictionary's most upvoted definition, Zillennials are those who can't completely identify as being part of a single generation and feel somewhat lost. One Redditor put it perfectly. I'm in the middle of an existential crisis. I can't tell which generation I'm a part of, so I made up my own. This isn't just about pop culture confusion. It's psychological displacement. Research on microgenerations shows that people born on generational cusps experience what psychologists call liminal identity. You exist in the threshold, neither here nor there, and that creates a specific kind of anxiety that both adjacent generations don't experience. Millennials know who they are. They're the generation that got screwed by the economy, but believed they could change the world. Gen Z knows who they are. They're digital natives who grew up with climate anxiety baked into their childhood. But Zillennials? You're constantly asking yourself, which team am I even on? And here's what's fascinating. That uncertainty created adaptability. Jason Dorsey, president of the Center for Generational Kinetics, describes Zillennials as equal parts idealistic and skeptical, analog roots with digital instincts. You're not confused, you're bilingual, and that's exhausting. Let's talk about what actually makes Zillennials psychologically unique. The technology timeline. You're 8 years old. The family computer lives in the living room where everyone can see your screen. You're playing Club Penguin or Habbo Hotel. Clearing your browser history is a survival skill because privacy doesn't exist yet. Internet access is gated. You get 30 minutes before someone needs to use the phone line. Fast forward 5 years. You're 13. You have a BlackBerry. BBM pins are the digital currency of your middle school. You're on Bebo, then MySpace for exactly 3 months before Facebook takes over, then Instagram, then Snapchat, then Vine dies. The platforms evolve faster than you can keep up. By the time you're in college, you're attending Zoom lectures on a laptop you can slip into a backpack. You didn't just adopt technology, you sprinted alongside its evolution at exactly the age when your brain is forming its relationship with attention, privacy, and identity. According to research on Zillennials by Fullscreen, this rapid succession of platforms gave them something both adjacent generations lack: fluency in multiple technological languages. Millennials are analog nostalgic. Gen Z are digital native. Zillennials are digital translators. But here's the cost nobody mentions. You learn digital literacy through trial and error. You posted regrettable things before anyone understood they'd live forever. You built the muscle memory of curating yourself online, while still remembering what it felt like to exist without that constant performance. One 25-year-old Zillennial interviewed by Refinery29 said, "When millennials bring up the dial-up internet tone, I always laugh like I remember it, but I definitely do not. That pressure to age up, to pretend you were there for experiences you barely caught the tail end of. That's psychological code switching in real time." Here's what really shaped Zillennial psychology. You were teenagers in 2008 when the economy collapsed. Not old enough to lose jobs yourselves, but definitely old enough to feel the anxiety seep into every dinner table conversation. You watched your parents worry about money in new ways. You saw older siblings graduate college and move back home. College transformed from an assumed next step into a high-stakes investment you weren't sure would pay off. According to research interviews, one recurring theme is economic pragmatism mixed with dashed dreams. One Redditor described the stereotypical Zillennial as someone who had high hopes as a kid, actor, writer, professional athlete, but dropped out of college for financial reasons and works a regular job now. Another painted it bleaker. You live in an apartment with 4 other people, regardless of age, no savings. You have like 3 jobs and Uber to make a living. That economic anxiety lodged itself differently than it did for adjacent generations. Millennials graduated into the recession and got crushed. Gen Z grew up in the recovery and normalized the instability. But Zillennials? You watched the collapse at exactly the age when you start thinking about your future, but can't yet affect it. A 2022 study by NACRI found that 50% of Zillennials call student debt assistance a must-have benefit. Over half report that unfulfilling jobs are their primary stress source. They're not lazy. They're realistic about systems that were broken before they even entered them. And then, just when Zillennials were supposed to be figuring things out, COVID-19 hit. If you were born closer to 1998, the pandemic rolled around right as you graduated college. If you were born closer to 1993, you were settling into your first real job. Either way, your early 20s, the years you're supposed to be building careers, relationships, and independence, happened in isolation. Career launches stalled, relationships formed and fell apart over Zoom. The social scaffolding that previous generations used to build their adult identity just disappeared. According to PYMNTS analysis, 54% of Zillennials are fully employed, but 53% identify unfulfilling work as a primary concern. And 25% are actively considering job changes for better benefits, not because they're entitled, because they've been economically traumatized twice before they hit 30. Here's what surprises people about Zillennials. They're intensely values-driven. According to research, they purchase as a means of self-expression. They'll pay more for fair trade coffee, not because it tastes better, but because it aligns with who they want to be. They're active in social movements. Black Lives Matter, climate justice, LGBTQ+ rights. They grew up watching millennials lay the groundwork for activism, but they experienced it during their formative years when identity solidifies. And unlike millennials who perform activism loudly, or Gen Z where activism is their entire identity, Zillennials are what researchers call poisoned by irony. They care deeply about issues but often act like they're too cool to care, because vulnerability feels risky when you've spent your whole life not quite fitting in. Here's where Zillennials diverge sharply from millennials. They watched the rise and grind hustle culture destroy their older peers and parents. They saw burnout glorified as ambition, and they said no. A 2023 workplace study found that 74% of Zillennials want paid or unpaid leave, 67% seek work-life management programs, and 62% desire mental health supports. They're not asking for participation trophies. They're demanding sustainability. One Zillennial described themselves as workplace ninjas, bridging generational gaps while enforcing mental health boundaries. They have side hustles, sure, but not as relentless grinding, as outlets for autonomy and supplemental income. They favor integrated lifestyles over glorified overwork. And that's not entitlement. That's learning from watching what broke everyone before them. Here's what nobody tells you about being a Zillennial. You'll spend your entire life feeling like you showed up too late for one party and too early for another. Millennials will think you're too young to understand their struggles. Gen Z will think you're too old to get theirs. But here's what you actually are. You're the last generation to remember a world that wasn't constantly documented. The first generation to build identity across rapid technological evolution. You're skeptical because you watched promises break in real time. You're adaptable because you had to be. You're not confused about who you are. You're fluent in 2 languages that weren't meant to coexist. You're not indecisive. You're making choices without a roadmap because yours was the first generation that didn't get one. And that in-between space? That's not weakness. That's perspective. You see both sides because you lived both sides. And in a world that keeps trying to put people in boxes, you're proof that the most interesting people exist in the spaces between. If this felt like someone was describing you specifically, you're not alone. This channel is for the ones who don't quite fit the labels. Subscribe to explore the psychology that makes you who you are. And if any of this resonated, drop a comment with your birth year. Let's see how many of us are out here trying to figure out which generation we're supposed to belong to. Because maybe the answer is neither, and maybe that's exactly the point.